A millionaire decides to open the doors of his mansion to victims of a devastating fire in California. But what he didn't expect was that among those people he would meet a woman who would change his life forever. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on more heartwarming stories like this one, and like the video to keep watching. The sun had barely risen, but the city of Santa Monica already seemed plunged into an eternal twilight. The sky, covered in thick smoke, exuded an apocalyptic tone. The winds carried soot and despair, while sirens echoed through the streets, announcing the arrival of another day of chaos. The forest fires had gotten out of control, and the dry heat emanating from the earth made the air almost impossible to breathe. Inside a small house in a humble neighborhood, Amelia Alvarez was running around, trying to save what she could. Her hands were shaking as she stuffed clothes, documents, and a few souvenirs into an old backpack. With every step, the ground seemed to shake beneath her feet, not from the fire, but from the uncertainty of everything she was about to lose. "Is that all?" she asked, more to herself than to the others. In the living room, her mother, Donna Maricela, was sitting in an armchair that had already been worn down by time. Her haggard face showed the exhaustion of a woman who had fought all her life and now seemed on the verge of succumbing. She coughed slightly, the hoarse, fragile sound cutting through the silence of the house. Luis, Amelia's younger brother, was stacking family photos in a makeshift box, his eyes too frightened for a boy of only 14. "We can't leave Daddy's painting," shouted Luis, clutching his father's old portrait in anxious hands. "Luis, we don't have time. Put it down," Amelia replied, her voice filled with a harshness that hid her growing fear. Smoke began to invade the house, creeping through the windows and doors like a dark warning. The smell of burning wood and destruction was suffocating. Amelia swallowed as she took her mother by the hand, helping her to her feet. "Everything's going to be all right, Mama. I promise." As much as she wanted to believe her own words, she knew they were empty. Everything they had, the small house, the memories that filled every corner, the silent dreams they had built there, was about to disappear. On the other side of town, Ethan Harlow was watching the tragedy from a different angle. From the rooftop of a luxurious hotel, he could see the thick smoke covering the horizon. Despite the distance, it was impossible not to feel the heat of the approaching disaster. He had been in Santa Monica for 2 days, bringing in resources to help with the evacuation and rescue efforts, but he felt that every move was insufficient. With a glass of whiskey in his hand, Ethan stared at his reflection in the glass of the window, the sight of a man used to being in control of everything, but now unable to contain the advance of the flames. The smoke outside seemed to echo the turmoil he carried inside, buried memories that insisted on surfacing. A knock on the door brought him out of his thoughts. Claire, his efficient and ruthless assistant, rushed in. "Mr. Harlow, the helicopter is ready. The fire is spreading rapidly in the western area, and the residents are panicking. We can get supplies there, but the evacuation efforts are a disaster." Ethan nodded slowly, placing his glass on the glass table with more force than he had intended. He had come to help, but the criticism he was receiving from the media for being the millionaire who wanted to play the hero was starting to weigh on him. "Let's go now," he said, adjusting the casual suit that seemed out of place in the midst of the tragedy. Deep down, he knew that his presence was just another temporary relief for the pain that no one would be able to completely erase. The evacuation in Amelia's neighborhood was chaotic. Fire trucks passed through the narrow streets, accompanied by carloads of families trying to escape. The sky grew darker and darker, and the flames, visible in the distance, danced like a curtain of destruction. Amelia helped her mother and brother into the old family car. But before getting in, she hesitated. Her father's portrait. It was just an object, but it contained the memory of a man who had given everything for his family before being swept away by a hurricane that destroyed the coast years ago. Amelia ran back into the house, ignoring the heat that was beginning to intensify. She picked up the painting and a few other photos on the table, but when she looked out of the window, she realized that the flames were closer than she had imagined. Her heart raced. As she left the house, she felt the fierce heat against her skin. She heard the sound of a helicopter in the sky, but she was focused on reaching the car. Her steps were quick, but fear made every movement seem too slow. Then a crash echoed in the distance. A burning log fell, partially blocking the street. In the helicopter, Ethan watched the scene unfold like a sequence from a nightmare. A young woman was running against time, panic in her eyes, carrying something he couldn't identify. He clenched his fists. "We need to get down there now." "Sir, we don't know if it's safe," replied the pilot, trying to rationalize the situation. "I said now." The helicopter began to descend as Ethan watched the young woman stumble, fall, and get up again. When the helicopter landed, he jumped without hesitation, ignoring the team's shouts. The smoke was suffocating, but he reached her before the flames closed the way. "Take my hand," he shouted, holding out his arm. Amelia looked at him, confused and reluctant, but the proximity of the fire made her give in. When their hands met, it was as if time stood still for a moment. Ethan pulled her tight and led her to the helicopter, where she was quickly helped to climb up along with her mother and brother. As the helicopter took off, Amelia looked down, seeing her house engulfed in flames. Everything she had promised to protect was disappearing before her eyes. She held her father's portrait tightly, but the tears flowed silently, wetting the glass of the frame. Ethan, sitting next to her, watched her. There were no words that could ease the pain, and he knew it. However, something in his heart tightened. Perhaps it was the look in her eyes, or perhaps it was the fact that for the first time in years, he felt part of that destruction. The helicopter landed on a remote property, surrounded by mountains still untouched by the flames. It was a cruel contrast to what Amelia had just left behind. The imposing mansion looked like a fortress of glass and concrete, isolated from the disaster. Manicured gardens surrounded the site, and the view of the hills opened up to a sky that, even stained with ash, seemed cleaner there. For Amelia, this place was another world, distant, unreachable, and completely oblivious to the chaos that was consuming lives. When Ethan helped Amelia down from the helicopter, she didn't thank him. She didn't have the strength. Her gaze was empty, and she still held her father's painting as if it were the last piece of herself she had left. Her mother, Doña Maricela, was shaking as she tried to get out with the help of one of Ethan's assistants. Luis, next to her, was staring at the horizon with red eyes. From the smoke, yes, but also from the silent tears he was holding back out of shame. "You're safe now," said Ethan, his voice low and calm. Ethan also decided that he was going to stay on the estate and not in the hotel. Amelia looked up for the first time since they had left the danger zone. There was something in his tone that irritated her, as if safety was something he could offer so easily. She knew that safety wasn't that simple for people like her. Still, she took a deep breath. "Safe?" she asked, almost as if she were talking to herself. "I've just lost everything I had." There was a moment of silence. Ethan didn't answer. Not because he didn't have something to say, but because he knew that no words would be enough. Her suffering was a field he didn't know how to cross, so he just chose to watch. Amelia pressed her lips together, refusing to let any more words escape. Her pain was not to be shared, least of all with a stranger. Ethan's team took the family inside the mansion. Ethan and his team were going to make a camp with shelters in the grounds of the estate, but until it was ready, the people stayed in the rooms they had in the mansion. Amelia hesitantly entered almost against her will. The entrance hall was huge, with high ceilings and windows that let in a soft light, broken only by the particles of smoke floating in the air. She had never been in such a grand place. Every piece of furniture looked like a work of art, and the smell was of something expensive and unknown. Everything there screamed wealth. "We have rooms prepared for all of you. Hot water, clean clothes, whatever you need," explained Claire, Ethan's assistant, with a polite though clearly forced smile. "We just need a place to rest. We won't bother you for long," Amelia replied quickly, more out of pride than politeness. Ethan, standing in the background, watched the conversation carefully. There was something about Amelia that intrigued him. While many of the homeless people he had helped that day were apathetic or frightened, she wore a look of determination, even with tears welling up in her eyes. It was as if she was fighting her own pain, forcing herself not to give in. It was something he recognized, something he himself had been doing for years. That night, while Amelia's family were finally able to rest, Ethan wandered out onto the balcony of the mansion. The smoke in the air seemed less dense there, but he could still taste its bitterness in his throat. Something was bothering him deeply, and he wasn't sure what it was. Perhaps it was the fact that despite all his donations and efforts, the fire was still relentless. Or perhaps it was that woman, who seemed to be carrying a world of responsibilities on her shoulders without asking for anyone's help. Upstairs, Amelia couldn't sleep. The room was comfortable, with soft sheets and a bed that seemed more luxurious than anything she had ever had in her life. But instead of comfort, it all felt suffocating. It wasn't hers. It wasn't part of her reality. Her mother was fast asleep, exhausted by the traumatic day, and Luis was on the sofa, clutching a pillow. Amelia sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the picture of her father in her hands. "You'd be so angry with me, Papa," she whispered, "if I couldn't save my family." She remembered that she couldn't do it alone, and she also didn't know exactly why Ethan bothered her so much. Maybe it was because he represented everything she would never have: security, control, resources. People like him never understood what it was like to lose everything, what it was like to have no choices. She clutched the portrait to her chest and tried to hold back the tears, but alone in the silence, she allowed a few to escape. The next morning, Ethan found Amelia in the garden, where she was watching Luis play with some of the children from other families who had also been sheltered there. He hesitated for a moment before approaching. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, his voice soft. She looked at him suspiciously. She had no patience for small talk, but she decided to answer, albeit briefly. "It was enough. If you need anything, just let us know. We're here to help." "Why do you do that?" Amelia asked suddenly, turning completely towards him. Her voice wasn't accusatory, but it carried a sharp curiosity, almost as if she wanted to challenge him. "People like you. Do you help because you really want to, or because it's a way of feeling better about yourself?" The question took him by surprise. Ethan, used to automatic compliments and gratitude, hadn't expected to be confronted. He took a deep breath before answering. "I lost my sister when I was young, in a tragedy. Since then, I've promised myself that if I could prevent other people from going through that, I would do everything in my power." Amelia hadn't expected that answer. For a moment, she felt bad for being so harsh, but before she could say anything, Ethan continued, "I'm not going to lie to you. Doing this does help me. In a way, it's like I'm making up for something, but that doesn't mean it's any less genuine." She stared at him, trying to decipher whether he was sincere. Despite everything, there was something in his eyes, a shadow perhaps, that made her believe he was telling the truth. Even so, it wasn't easy to let her guard down. "I can't thank you enough for what you've done for me and my family, but we're not your charity, Mr. Harlow," she said firmly, before turning and walking back into the house. Ethan stood still, watching her walk away. He couldn't help but smile slightly. Despite everything she had been through, Amelia still carried a strength that fascinated him. She wasn't like the people around her, the ones who only said what he wanted to hear. No, Amelia was different. When she disappeared inside the mansion, Ethan looked up at the sky. The ashes were still falling slowly, like burnt snowflakes. He knew that the fire was far from over, as was the complexity of the woman who now occupied his mind. And then, in a corner of the garden, he saw Luis with his father's picture in his hands, showing it to another child. Ethan realized that Amelia's family carried much more than loss. They carried stories that he, for some reason, felt he needed to know. The next morning began with light filtering through the mansion's huge windows, tinting the room with a soft glow that contrasted with the chaos that still reigned outside that bubble of safety. Amelia was sitting on the edge of the bed, her arms crossed around her body and her gaze lost in the landscape of the garden. Luis was still asleep on the makeshift sofa, but Donna Maricela, sitting in the armchair next to him, was watching her daughter with attentive eyes, full of the wisdom she had accumulated over a lifetime. "Didn't you sleep well, my child?" asked her mother, in her hoarse, tired voice, but full of tenderness. Amelia was slow to answer. The words of the night before were still echoing in her mind. Ethan, with his calm speech and distant gaze, had revealed something she hadn't expected. He was human, after all, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake her natural mistrust. "It's hard to sleep in a place like this," Amelia finally replied, avoiding looking at her mother. It's not ours. We don't belong here. Maricela sighed and pulled her shawl over her shoulders. Her face, although marked by time and hardship, still bore a serenity that Amelia envied. And where should we be, on the street? In the middle of the fire? The question was asked without harshness, but it carried a weight that Amelia couldn't ignore. You may not like it here, Amelia, but you're keeping us alive. I know that, Mama, Amelia retorted more defensively than she would have liked. I just don't know why he's doing all this. People like him. People like him? Interrupted Doña Maricela, arching an eyebrow. What kind of people? Rich? Generous? Those who reached out when no one else would? Amelia, you're so used to carrying the world on your back that you can't believe it when someone wants to help you. Amelia pressed her lips together, swallowing the words that threatened to come out. He's just another rich man trying to ease his conscience, Mama. I don't want to owe him anything. Do you think it's a debt? Maricela leaned forward, resting her trembling hands on her knees. I don't know where you got all this bitterness from, my child. This man, with all the faults and defects you think he has, saved our lives. If it hadn't been for him in that helicopter, Luis and I wouldn't be here. Do you think it's fair to treat him like this? Amelia remained silent. She knew her mother was right, but accepting this was difficult. It was like giving up a part of herself. The armor she had built up over the years to survive in a world that rarely gave her anything without asking a high price in return. You don't have to like him, Amelia. You don't have to trust him right away. But be grateful? You can do that. Donna Maricela leaned back again, closing her eyes for a moment. And who knows? Maybe it's time to stop looking at people always expecting the worst. Her mother's words echoed like a silent blow. Amelia knew there was truth in them, but accepting Ethan's kindness felt like an internal battle that she still didn't know how to win. Later that morning, Amelia made a decision. She picked up her father's painting and placed it carefully on a piece of furniture in her room, as if she needed to leave a part of herself there before doing what she had been putting off. She walked down the silent corridor of the mansion, her footsteps echoing on the cold marble, until she reached the main room. Claire, Ethan's assistant, was in the middle of the room, typing frantically on her tablet as she gave instructions to the staff coming and going. Where's Ethan? Amelia asked, trying to sound calmer than she really was. Claire glanced at her, without pausing what she was doing. He left early. He's with the helicopter on another rescue mission. He'll be gone all day. Amelia felt a twinge of frustration, but she didn't let it show. Claire noticed her silence and for the first time looked up. Do you need anything? No, replied Amelia, shaking her head. I just wanted to… Thank you. Claire narrowed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to decipher Amelia, but said nothing. She went back to her tablet and Amelia turned to leave. As she walked through the garden, she saw the movement of men unloading building materials and equipment from a large truck parked at the entrance. They seemed to be assembling something in the open field behind the house. Curious, she approached, watching as the workers loaded pieces of wood and metal structures. We're extending the shelter, explained one of the men, noticing her attentive gaze. Mr. Harlow wants more space for the families who keep coming. Amelia remained silent for a moment, observing the efficiency with which the men worked. They set up the structures quickly, erecting tents that looked big enough to house dozens of people. It was impossible to ignore the effort being made there, or the intention behind it. Do you need help? She asked, surprising herself with the offer. The man looked at her suspiciously at first, but then shrugged. You can start by organizing these supplies here. Amelia rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She stacked boxes of supplies, sorted clothes and blankets, and helped set up makeshift beds inside the tents. It was hard work, but it was something she knew how to do. Be busy, be useful, be productive. As she worked, she noticed that some people from the shelter began to approach her to help too. Before long, there was a small group organizing the space, all united by a common tragedy. Amelia felt something strange growing inside her, a connection, something that went beyond loss and fear. In the late afternoon, as the sun hid behind the hills and the sky took on an orange hue, Amelia stopped for a moment to look at what they had built. The field, which had once been just an empty space, was now filled with organized tents lit by portable lamps. Children ran between the shelters, while adults chatted and helped each other. It was as if that piece of land had become something more than just a shelter. Claire appeared beside her, arms crossed and tablet still in hand. "He'll be glad to know you helped," she commented, without taking her eyes off what was happening around her. Amelia didn't respond immediately. There was still a battle going on inside her, but for the first time, something seemed to give way. She knew that when Ethan returned, she would need to talk to him, not just to thank him, but to understand. And maybe, just maybe, to accept that the world wasn't as black and white as she had imagined. In the late afternoon, the helicopter descended slowly over the makeshift field on Ethan's property, kicking up dust and making the newly erected tents sway in the wind from the propellers. The sound of the engine gradually subsided, but the movement in the shelter continued. Newly rescued families, some still with sooty clothes and faces marked by fatigue, disembarked from the helicopter with the help of the volunteers. Stunned and relieved looks ran through the place, while children clutched their parents' hands in silence. Ethan climbed down last, his shoulders heavy from the physical and mental exhaustion of another day of rescues. Even so, his eyes scanned the field before him with what seemed for the first time in a long time a spark of satisfaction. The space, once empty, was now a small refuge, organized and functional. The tents were lined up, with makeshift beds inside them, areas for distributing food and supplies properly separated, and an atmosphere that, despite the shared pain, radiated a sense of community. He knew that this result had not been achieved by his team alone. He had heard from Claire as they flew over the region that Amelia had been involved in the work. He smiled slightly as he imagined the girl who, until then, had seemed so determined to keep her distance, now taking part in something bigger. "Mr. Harlow, we have another team arriving to unload supplies," Claire informed him, approaching while checking her tablet. "Should I supervise, or do you want to take care of it?" "You can take over for me, Claire," Ethan replied, running a hand through his dusty, sweaty hair. "I need a shower and something to eat." Claire nodded, and Ethan began to walk slowly towards the mansion, greeting some of the new residents on the way. He exchanged quick words with a few people, but his gaze always seemed to return to the countryside, where there was now movement and life. It was a small step forward in the midst of so much destruction, but for him it made all the difference. After a hot bath and a simple meal, Ethan went out onto the veranda of the mansion, where the silence of the night invited him to reflect. The sky, still slightly smudged with smoke, now showed a few shy stars. He leaned back in one of the chairs with a glass of whiskey in his hand, something that had become a habit over the last few nights. Despite his tiredness, his mind was racing. He knew there was still a lot to do, more people to rescue, more lives to rebuild. The soft footsteps of someone approaching brought him out of his thoughts. When he turned his face, he saw Amelia standing there, her hands clasped together in front of her body. For a moment she hesitated, as if reconsidering her decision to speak to him. But then she took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Can I sit down?" she asked, her voice low and cautious. "Of course," he replied, gesturing to the chair next to her. Amelia sat down, her back stiff and her eyes fixed on the horizon. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Ethan didn't push her to speak, waiting for her to take the initiative. "I wanted to thank you," she began, finally breaking the silence, "for everything you're doing." He turned to look at her, surprised by the sincere tone in her voice. "I heard you helped out today," he replied with a slight smile. "You didn't have to, but I'm glad you did. The shelter looks amazing. I thought that if I was going to stay here, I should be useful in some way," she said, shrugging. "Besides, seeing all those people arriving, you can't ignore it." Ethan nodded, letting her speak. There was something different about Amelia that night, a vulnerability he hadn't seen before. "It's not easy for me to trust people," she continued, staring at the glass of whiskey in his hand, as if the movement of the liquid would distract her from her own hesitation. "I've always had the impression that when someone offers something, it's because they want something in return." Ethan didn't reply immediately. He knew it wasn't the time for justifications or explanations, just to listen. "When I was 16, my mother became very ill for the first time," Amelia began, her voice sounding more fragile with every word. We had no money for treatment, so my father asked a friend for help, someone he trusted. This man promised that he would help us, that he would do his best to pay for the medication and whatever else we needed. She paused, clasping her hands in her lap, as if trying to stop them from shaking. Ethan noticed the effort and felt a lump form in his throat, but remained quiet. My father owed him more than he could ever repay. He worked until he got sick. When we finally managed to pay it off, he was already very weak. Amelia took a deep breath, as if trying to hold back the tears. And then, when Mum got sick again, there was no one left to help. Ethan looked at her for a moment, trying to absorb what she had shared. It explained so much about the woman she was, the strength, the toughness, the unwillingness to accept kindness. He leaned forward a little, placing his glass on the table between them. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, Amelia," he said, his voice low and sincere, "but not everyone who helps wants something in return." She finally faced him, her eyes full of doubt and something that seemed like a silent plea for hope. "Maybe I need to learn to believe that," she replied, her voice almost a whisper. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was lighter, as if the barrier between them had begun to crack. Amelia took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts, and then spoke again. "I want to go with you tomorrow." Ethan arched his eyebrows, surprised by the request. "Go with me? I want to help," she said more firmly. "Not just here, but outside. I want to see what's happening up close, to see the people who still need help." He hesitated, worried about the risks. But then, as he looked at her, he saw the determination in her eyes. It was the same look she had when she ran back to save her father's portrait from the flames. "It's dangerous," he said, as a warning, but not as a negative. "I know," she replied with a small smile. "But it's much more dangerous to stand by and do nothing." Ethan shook his head, unable to hide a slight smile at her obstinacy. "All right then. You can come with me," he finally replied. "But if anything goes wrong, you go straight back to the helicopter, understand?" "Understood." The deal was sealed, and Amelia felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was taking control of something, instead of just reacting to what life threw at her. Ethan watched as she stood up, ready to go back inside. She seemed lighter, as if she had left a piece of the weight she was carrying there on the balcony. When she disappeared through the door, he looked at the horizon again. There was something about Amelia that made him want to be better, to do more. And for the first time in years, he felt that he wasn't just making up for his past. He was building something new. The sun was still rising when Amelia appeared in the area where Ethan's helicopter was already being prepared for the day's mission. She carried a small rucksack on her back and wore practical clothes, jeans, worn boots, and a simple blouse. But her gaze was firm and determined, as if there was nothing that could shake her decision to help that day. Ethan, who was talking to the pilot, stopped in mid-sentence when he saw her. He couldn't disguise the surprise and respect that was growing inside him. It wasn't common to meet women like Amelia, especially in the world he was used to. Not only had she survived a tragedy that would have destroyed most people, but she still found the strength to want to do more to help others, even though her own pain was still so fresh. "Are you ready?" he asked, walking towards her with a discreet smile on his face. "I always have been," she replied, looking straight at him without hesitation. Ethan was silent for a moment, just watching her. It wasn't just what she said, but how she said it. Every word carried a rare conviction. He had met many people in his life, powerful men and women, entrepreneurs, leaders of organizations, but nothing in the corporate world compared to the quiet strength he saw in Amelia. "Right," he said, nodding. "Let's go." They boarded the helicopter and were soon in the air, flying over an area devastated by the fires. The land below was a mosaic of destruction, charred trees, houses reduced to ashes, and streets where desperate people were still struggling to salvage what they could. Amelia kept her eyes fixed on the window the whole way, her lips tight and her eyes filled with an almost painful determination. When they landed in a makeshift field, Ethan saw her turn. There was no hesitation. She immediately began to help. While he coordinated with the other volunteers and spoke to the local teams, Amelia was among the people, distributing water, helping to organize supplies, and talking to the families who had lost everything. Ethan stood still for a moment, watching her from afar. She had no training, no obligation to be there, but she moved like someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. She didn't just offer words of comfort, although she did so with a kindness he never expected to see in someone so hardened by life. Amelia carried boxes, helped children find their parents, and at one point even managed to rescue a dog trapped in a partially burnt fence. Ethan was impressed, almost enchanted. He realized that something inside him was beginning to change. There was a simplicity in the way Amelia saw the world. She wasn't looking for recognition or thanks. She simply did what she thought was right. And that made him wonder how long it had been since he had done something with such purity of intention. When they finally stopped for something to eat, Ethan prepared 2 makeshift sandwiches with the supplies available and handed one to Amelia. She accepted it unceremoniously, taking a seat on the floor next to him among some boxes of supplies. "How many people do you think you've managed to rescue so far?" she asked, taking a bite of her sandwich. Ethan thought for a moment, looking at the horizon. "I've lost count," he admitted with a small smile, "but it's still not enough." "It never is it?" she said, looking at him sideways. "No, but every person we manage to get out makes it all worthwhile." Amelia nodded, and for a brief moment Ethan watched her smile as she chewed absent-mindedly. Her smile was something rare, but in that instant, it was there, and it was sincere. There was something infectious about her expression, a kind of silent victory, as if, despite everything, this moment was a small achievement. Ethan realized he was smiling too, without even realizing it. When they returned to the shelter that night, tiredness weighed heavily on both of them. The helicopter landed safely and they descended, accompanied by a small rescue team that had worked with them during the day. The rescued families were greeted with care, and once again Amelia didn't hesitate to help settle them into the tents. Ethan watched her from afar as she talked to Claire about the plans for the next day. There was something about Amelia that he couldn't ignore, something that went beyond her strength or determination. It was as if, for some inexplicable reason, she was exactly the person he needed at that moment in his life, someone to remind him of what really mattered. Later, after a hot bath and a moment's rest, Ethan went downstairs for dinner. The main table of the mansion was set with a simple but comforting meal. He had expected to find Amelia there, but to his surprise, she hadn't arrived yet. When she finally appeared, he almost lost his breath. Amelia had exchanged her worn-out clothes for a light, loose white dress, which she had clearly found among the donations. The delicate fabric fell softly over her body, and her hair, still wet, was loose, falling down her back in natural waves. She looked completely different, almost unreal. It was as if the strong, practical woman he had seen all day had been replaced by another version of her, one he hadn't expected. Amelia hesitated in the doorway as she noticed Ethan's gaze on her. His eyes seemed to shine in a way she couldn't decipher, but it made her uncomfortable. She wasn't used to receiving this kind of attention, least of all from someone like him. "Is something wrong?" she asked, trying to break the silence. Ethan blinked as if coming out of a trance and shook his head quickly. "None." He smiled, trying to look casual. "I just didn't think you were the type to wear dresses." She arched an eyebrow, clearly provoked by the joke. "I'm not," she admitted, tugging lightly at the fabric between her fingers. "But it was either that or keep wearing the same old clothes." "Well, it looks good," he said, looking away from her to the plate on the table, feeling that he was being too obvious. She smiled slightly, but didn't say anything, just sat down on the other side of the table. They began to eat, exchanging a few words about the day's rescues, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. On the contrary, it was as if they were both somehow beginning to understand each other without needing much explanation. Ethan watched her as she ate, unaware that his gaze was more intense than it should have been. Amelia, for her part, seemed more at ease than she had ever been there, as if she was finally allowing the weight of her worries to lift, even if only for a moment. Something had changed between them, and they both felt it. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, growing with every moment they spent together. The fire, which had consumed forests, houses, and dreams, had finally been brought under control. After 6 days of horror, the flames had surrendered to the ceaseless efforts of the firefighters and the help of nature, with calmer winds and humidity bringing some relief. The surrounding landscape was still one of devastation. Ash covered the ground, burnt trees stretched out branches like skeletal hands, and the marks of destruction were everywhere. But on Ethan's property, the temporary shelter was still full of life. Amelia walked through the now more organized camp, watching the children playing around the tents. There was a different energy in the air, one of relief, perhaps. The danger had passed, but the uncertainty of the future remained. Many of the families sheltered there had lost everything and didn't know how to start again. She knew what it was like to live without certainty, but now she was in a different position. She was the one helping. Ethan stood on the balcony of the mansion, watching Amelia from a distance. She looked exhausted but determined as ever. He wondered how someone who had been through so much could keep going. Over the last few days, she had become a constant presence in his mind, and not just because of her story. It was something deeper, something he didn't know how to name, but which grew with every moment they spent together. It was then that he saw her suddenly run towards the tent where her mother was resting. Something in his gut alerted him, and he quickly went downstairs to follow her. Inside the tent, Doña Maricela was sitting on her makeshift bed, her breathing visibly heavy and her face pale. Amelia was kneeling beside her, holding her hand as her eyes filled with tears. "Mama, what's happening?" "You were fine yesterday," said Amelia, her voice trembling. Maricela tried to smile, but even that seemed like an effort. "It's just tiredness, my child. Nothing to worry about." But Ethan, who was already at their side, knew it wasn't just tiredness. He had seen it before in other tragedies, in other homeless people. Donna Maricela's body, already frail, was succumbing to the stress and difficult conditions. "We need to take her to hospital now," said Ethan firmly. "No!" Donna Maricela tried to protest, but her voice was weak. "I don't want to cause any more problems." "Mama, please don't say that," Amelia begged, holding her hand tighter. "I'll take care of it, Amelia," said Ethan, already calling the driver. "Get your things. We're taking you now." The drive to the hospital was silent, except for Amelia's whispered prayers. She held her mother's hand in the back seat of the car, while Ethan looked at them through the rearview mirror. He had never felt so powerless. He knew that his influence and resources could do a lot, but not all the wealth in the world could fight the inevitable. When they arrived at the hospital, Donna Maricela was rushed to the emergency room. Amelia stayed in the waiting room, pacing back and forth, unable to sit still. Ethan tried to calm her down, but his words didn't seem to reach her. So he contented himself with just sitting there in silence, available for the moment she needed him. Hours passed before a doctor came out of the door with a grave countenance. Amelia's heart seemed to stop. "We did everything we could," said the doctor, with an expression full of compassion. Her heart was very weak. "She asked for you before she left." Amelia felt the ground disappear beneath her feet, but she forced her legs to move. Ethan held her by the arm, like a silent support, as she walked to the room where her mother was. Maricela was lying on the bed, her eyes tired but full of love as she watched her daughter approach. "My little girl," she said, her voice low. Amelia fell to her knees beside the bed, holding her hands tightly, as if she could keep her there for longer. "Mama, please don't go. I still need you. Luis needs you." Maricela smiled with difficulty, stroking her daughter's face with trembling fingers. "My dear, you're stronger than you think. God has put good people in your life. He put Ethan to save us. You just need to believe that there are still people who want your good. Don't be afraid to trust, Amelia. Don't harden your heart." "Mama, please, promise me that you'll take care of your brother. He'll need you, just as you needed me. Be a light for him, just as you have always been for me." Amelia's tears fell freely as she nodded, unable to form words. Maricela smiled one last time before closing her eyes, and Amelia felt the moment when life left her mother's body. The return to the shelter was silent. Amelia looked like a shadow of herself, her gaze empty as she held the small crucifix her mother wore. Ethan, who had never felt so useless, didn't know what to say. He knew that no words could ease the pain. Over the next few days, Ethan did everything he could to ensure that Amelia and Luis had the support they needed. He organized Doña Maricela's funeral, arranged psychological help for Luis, and made sure that Amelia didn't have to worry about anything. But even so, she seemed distant, as if part of her had been buried with her mother. Ethan knew he had to do something. He watched her walking around the shelter, mechanically helping with chores, but without the sparkle and energy he had admired so much before. Then an idea struck him. The following evening, he called her to talk. They sat on the veranda of the mansion, where so many conversations had taken place before. Amelia was tired, but her curiosity made her wait for his words. "Amelia, I've been thinking a lot about all this," he began, looking up at the sky. "About the people here, about what happened to your mother, Hildis, and about you." She looked at him, her eyes still sad but attentive. "I want to create something that will last longer than just this temporary shelter, something that really helps these people rebuild their lives." "What are you suggesting?" she asked, frowning. "A community center," he replied with a slight smile. "A place where people can find support, resources, and even work. I want you to be in charge of it, Amelia. I want you to run it, to turn it into something great." She blinked, surprised. "Me? Why?" "Because no one understands these people like you do. You know what they've been through, and you know what they need. And because I believe in you, Amelia." She was silent for a long moment, absorbing his words. Something inside her, which had been closed since her mother's death, seemed to slowly open up. "I don't know if I can." "You can, and I'll be here to help you." The intensity in his gaze made her feel something she hadn't felt for a long time: hope. For the first time since her mother's death, Amelia felt that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. And as they stood there, looking at the horizon, they both knew that what they were building went far beyond a community center. It was something that was beginning to grow between them. Something strong, unexpected, and impossible to ignore. The days began to turn into weeks, and little by little the open wound in Amelia's heart began to heal. It wasn't easy. Her mother's absence was a constant shadow, especially when Louise sometimes unknowingly called out to her as if she were still there. But Ethan stayed by their side, in a way that Amelia never imagined anyone could. Ethan looked after Louise as if the boy were his own son. It wasn't forced or calculated, but genuine. He would take Louise to see the helicopters, explain how the machines worked, and even let him try out some of the lighter equipment under supervision. Louise, who at first seemed lost and withdrawn, began to open up, and to Amelia's surprise, he even smiled more. One afternoon, while Ethan was teaching Louise how to fly a small drone, a gift he had given the boy, Amelia watched them from afar. Louise laughed at something Ethan said, and the sound was so pure that it warmed Amelia's heart, even in the midst of the sadness she still carried. She crossed her arms and stood there, absorbing the scene, trying to understand how that man, who had seemed so distant at first, had become a point of light in their lives. When Ethan looked in her direction and caught her watching, she looked away quickly, feeling her cheeks flush. But it was too late. He had already noticed, and a small, discreet smile curved his lips. The search for space for the community center was the next big step. Ethan didn't want something temporary. He wanted a place that could serve as a real pillar for the community. Amelia, reluctant at first, was now deeply involved in the project. They spent days visiting places in and around the city, from abandoned warehouses to empty lots. Luis always accompanied them, with his drone and cell phone in hand, recording everything. He had decided on his own to document the progress of the project and post it on social media. "People need to see what we're doing," he said, with an excitement that surprised Amelia. "Maybe they'll want to help." Amelia had her doubts, but Ethan thought the idea was brilliant. He even helped Luis create an account dedicated exclusively to the project. Before long, the boy was posting short videos of Ethan and Amelia discussing ideas for the center, photos of the places they visited, and even testimonials from people who would benefit. "I can't believe he's doing this on his own," Amelia commented one evening, while reviewing the sketches of the project on the living room table. "He's got talent, Amelia." Ethan leaned over her shoulder, looking at one of the videos Louise had posted. His closeness made Amelia feel a slight warmth creep up her neck. "He's turning out to be an incredible boy. You should be proud." "I am," She smiled, but the emotion in her voice was evident. Luis's work soon began to gain attention. The posts reached more people than they had expected, and soon the first comments began to appear. Messages of support, questions about how to help, and eventually, donations. In a matter of days, Ethan began to receive calls from people offering resources, building materials, and even volunteer services. "This is getting big," Ethan commented as he showed Amelia an email from a large company interested in sponsoring the project. "Too big," she said, with a tone of concern. "That's good, Amelia. The bigger it is, the more people we can help." She knew he was right, but the sudden success was something that made her uncomfortable. Amelia had always lived on the margins, away from the spotlight, but now she found herself at the center of something much bigger than she could have imagined. One afternoon, while walking through one of the candidate sites for the community center, Ethan and Amelia stopped at a large plot of land with a view that opened up to green hills and a road that led directly to the city center. "It's perfect," said Ethan, his eyes shining as he looked around. "Enough space for everything we need." "Space, yes." Amelia crossed her arms, analyzing the terrain with a critical eye. "But what about the cost? We've already received enough donations to get started, and more are on the way." He turned to her, smiling. "Don't worry, I know what I'm doing." "Of course you do," she replied, rolling her eyes, but the playful tone in her voice pleased Ethan. As they walked through the grounds, Ethan watched her discreetly. There was something about Amelia that captivated him more every day. Her strength, her resilience, and even her stubborn way of always finding something practical to do, even when she was exhausted. He knew he was falling in love with her, and from the way she sometimes looked at him when she thought he wasn't seeing, he suspected that she felt the same way. That evening, after a long day, Ethan prepared a simple dinner for them. Luis was in his room, editing more videos, leaving Ethan and Amelia alone in the dining room. Amelia came downstairs in a comfortable outfit, but even so, Ethan found it hard not to notice the softness of her features, the way her hair fell loosely around her shoulders. They dined in silence for a while, but the silence between them never seemed empty. It was as if each other's presence was enough. "You've been amazing, you know that?" Ethan suddenly said, breaking the silence. Amelia looked at him in surprise. "Don't exaggerate." "I'm not exaggerating." He smiled. "I see what you do, how people trust you. This center will be a reflection of that, Amelia. A reflection of you." She looked away, trying to hide the slight blush on her cheeks, but inside, those words touched her in a way she hadn't expected. After dinner, while they were on the terrace, Ethan approached her, almost without thinking. "Thank you for trusting me," he said, his voice low. "I don't know if I trusted you completely at first," she admitted, smiling slightly. "But you showed me that I was wrong." Ethan took a step closer, and the air between them seemed to change. Their gazes met, and for a moment, it seemed as if the whole world had stopped. "Amelia," he began, but his voice failed him. She knew what he meant because she felt the same way. But before she could reply, Luis appeared in the doorway, interrupting the moment. "You need to see this," said the boy, excitedly holding up his cell phone. They laughed a little nervously, but they knew that this moment wasn't over. What they felt was growing, and there was no ignoring it. "You won't believe it," said Luis, agitated. Amelia and Ethan followed him to the entrance, and when the doors opened, the sight left them speechless. 2 huge trucks were parked in front of the property, with the drivers already getting off to organize the deliveries. People began to get out of the vehicles, carrying boxes and boxes of groceries, clothes, toys, and basic necessities. "Luis, what have you done?" Amelia asked, her tone one of surprise mixed with incredulity. "I just showed them what we were doing," he replied, his eyes shining with pride. People saw the videos and started donating. Some shared, and now people are coming from all over to help. Ethan laughed, shaking his head in admiration. He put his hand on the boy's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You have more talent than I thought, my friend." Luis smiled, but his eyes were fixed on the proud expression on Amelia's face. For him, that moment was more important than any comment or like he had received. The trucks began to be unloaded, and the temporary camp around the property soon became a veritable hub of activity. Volunteers approached, offering to help organize the items. Families who had lost everything began to receive new clothes, fresh food, and even toys for the children. Amelia, who until then had seemed stunned, soon sprang into action. Her experience at the shelter over the last few weeks guided her, and before long she was coordinating the distribution of supplies, dividing up tasks among the volunteers, and ensuring that no one left empty-handed. Ethan watched everything from afar, as he always did, but this time there was something different in his gaze. It wasn't just admiration, it was love. He knew at that moment that there was no denying what he felt. Amelia was extraordinary, and she had changed everything. Weeks had passed since the fire had been brought under control, and California was slowly beginning to rebuild. The scars of the disaster were still visible: burned forests, neighborhoods reduced to rubble, families trying to start over from scratch. But amidst the devastation, hope was flourishing. Community efforts, such as the one led by Ethan and Amelia, were a reflection of human strength in its purest form. People who had lost everything were volunteering to help others in the same situation. Local and international organizations continued to send aid. And in the midst of it all, the community center that Ethan and Amelia were building had become a symbol of new beginnings. Luis continued to document everything, and the videos had gone viral. The boy, who once seemed lost, was now a confident young man with a clear mission: to show the world the power of solidarity. He had become a kind of reporter for the project, and his energy was contagious. While the community center wasn't ready, the families in the temporary shelter received more support than Amelia and Ethan could have imagined. The makeshift camp had become a living space where people shared stories, offered each other comfort, and above all found reasons to believe in better days. One afternoon, while Amelia was organizing boxes of donations with some volunteers, a little girl approached, holding a small teddy bear. "Aunt Amelia, I wanted to give you this," said the little girl, holding out the toy with a shy smile. Amelia knelt down to meet the child, her eyes filling with tears as she realized the gesture. "But it's your teddy bear." "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I'm sure. You're good to us, and my mommy says we have to give something back." Amelia held the teddy carefully, as if it was something precious, and hugged the little girl. Ethan, who had been watching the scene from afar, felt something inside him stir. He knew he needed to talk to Amelia. He needed to make his feelings clear before the moment passed. That evening, as the temporary camp began to quieten down and the families retired to rest, Ethan went out onto the balcony of the mansion. He knew he would find Amelia there. It was the place she went whenever she needed to think. She was leaning against the railing, looking up at the starry sky with the little girl's teddy bear in her hands. Ethan approached slowly, but she already knew he was there. "It's been a long day," he said, leaning against the railing next to her. "Every day has been long," she replied with a small smile, "but today was special." Ethan was silent for a moment, just watching her. The moonlight illuminated her face in a way that mesmerized him even more. He knew that this was the moment. "Amelia," he began, his voice low. She turned her face to look at him, and what she saw in his eyes made her hold her breath. It wasn't just admiration or gratitude. It was something deeper, something she didn't know if she was ready to accept, but that she couldn't deny she felt too. "I need to say something." He took a step closer, and she didn't flinch. "You changed my life, Amelia. I thought I was here to help, but the truth is that you were the one who helped me." She stared at him, her heart racing. "Ethan, you're the strongest woman I've ever met, and I don't want to pretend anymore that this is just about the job or the project. I'm in love with you, Amelia." The words hit him like a thunderbolt, and for a moment she felt like she couldn't breathe. But then everything became clear. She knew from the start that there was something different about him. Something that made her want to let her guard down, even when everything inside her was screaming at her to keep her distance. "I'm in love with you too, Ethan," she said at last, her voice almost a whisper. He smiled, the kind of smile she had never seen on him before, full of relief, joy, and love. And then, before she could think, he took another step forward and pulled her into a kiss. It was soft, but full of everything they had held in until that moment. All the unspoken words, all the barriers that had been broken down were in that kiss. When they pulled away, they were both smiling, as if the world around them had disappeared. The following days were full of progress and hope. Donations kept coming in, the community center was progressing rapidly, and the families in the shelter were beginning to find reasons to dream again. California, devastated though it was rebuilding, not just in buildings and roads, but in hearts and souls. And Ethan and Amelia, now side by side, were at the center of it all, not just as leaders, but as a couple who had found something more precious than any material good: love. Luis continued to record everything, and in one of his final videos he said, "My mother always said that even in the worst storms there's always a rainbow waiting, and I think our rainbow is right here." Amelia and Ethan, hugging behind him, smiled. They knew that the future would still bring challenges, but now they would face everything together. And so amidst the ashes, life blossomed again. What did you think of this story? Leave your opinion here in the comments and tell us how you would rate it from 0 to 10. We also want to know, were you as moved as we were to create this narrative full of love, overcoming, and hope? If you liked it, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel to support our work and allow us to continue bringing stories that touch the heart. And don't leave just yet. Watch the video that's appearing on your screen now. We're sure it will inspire you too. Thank you for being here with us.